After we have the understanding for the IPsec VPN protocol, now let's have a look some commonly used VPN scenario. The first one we called the Dynamic Peer VPN. Dynamic Peer VPN. As you can see from this topology, so one VPN site, which is firewall B, that using a dynamic IP address, for example, the PPPoE dial, and one site that using a fixed IP address. Or if you don't have the IP in firewall 1, we also can use the DDNS domain as a static address, instead of the fixed IP. So you can use either fixed IP address or the domain or the DDNS domain as the static. But at least one side need to have the static IP. Otherwise, you are not able to initiate the VPN connection. To create this VPN connection in the dynamic IP environment, we must initiate the negotiation request from the firewall that assigned with dynamic IP address, So this one will be the initiator, and the firewall with the fixed IP address will be the responder. And after the negotiation, we will set up the IPsec tunnel, and both sides they can access to each other through the VPN tunnel. Let's have a look how to configure the Dynamic Peer VPN. What is the difference? As we mentioned during the HCSA, if you are using the dynamic IP for the VPN peer, the phase 1 negotiation mode, you need to use the aggressive mode. So you need to set at both firewall with the static IP and also the firewall with the dynamic IP, and pay attention for the negotiation mode and also the IP type and the local ID. Let's have a look for those configuration at both firewall A and firewall B. So firewall A is the firewall with the fixed IP address, and firewall B is used the dynamic IP. So for the firewall A, so we can assign the static IP address at the interface, especially that the one interface that connect to internet. So this is the fixed public IP, and also we can add a default IP route to access to internet. And for the firewall B, which is using the DHCP service to get the IP address that distributed from the DHCP server, and then we can also set the route that distributed from the DHCP server. And for the VPN configuration, for phase 1 SA, the one that with fixed IP, we need to use the mode as aggressive. So both sides, the mode must be the same, aggressive. And the one with fixed IP, when you configure for the peer, so this is the peer configuration. So the peer that using IP dynamic, so we use the dynamic, and then you need to add the peer ID. In this case, we are using FQDN. So you need to specify for FQDN name. So FQDN could be a host name or domain name. So you must specify use the same ID, use the same ID for the one that with dynamic IP. So in the firewall B, we also need to configure for the peer information. So for the firewall B, the peer will be the firewall A, which is using static IP. And the peer IP address is the IP that assigned in firewall A one interface, which is 200. And your local IP, because you are using dynamic, so your local IP is the local ID FQDN. So that is the domain name. After that, we need to configure for the phase 2. So phase 2, the configuration is the same. We need to create the tunnel, and assign with the phase 2 proposal and connection auto connect. And then you need to configure for the tunnel interface, and also the tunnel route. So both sides you need to create for the tunnel interface, and also you need to add the specific route for this tunnel interface, to route the traffic to the peer LAN. And then you may also need to add for some address entry for both your local LAN and also peer LAN. In this case, you can use the policy to control for the access direction between both sides by controlling for both source address and destination address for your local LAN and the peer LAN. And it should be bidirectional. After that, we had done all the configuration for the dynamic VPN, IPsec VPN, and then you can use the show ISA KMPSA to check for the phase 1 proposal, and show IPsec SA to check for the phase 2 proposal. As you can see here, both phase 1 and phase 2 already is established, and the status is active. As you can see, A is for active. As I mentioned, if both sides are using dynamic IP, we can also use the DDNS functions. So DDNS can be treated as a fixed IP, as a static. So in this case, you need to configure for DDNS first, by adding the DDNS to the specific interface, adding the DDNS domain to the specific interface, and then you need to specify the provider of this DDNS and also the login to the DDN server. After that, you can configure that the site using DDNS as a static IP, and then the IP will be the DDNS domain. So that is the solution for both VPN sites that using dynamic. We are using DDNS solution. And these slides just give you some idea for the phase 1 negotiation for the packet processing. So this is the main mode. This is the aggressive mode. As I mentioned, main mode using 6 messages for the negotiation, and aggressive mode only 3 message. So this is just for your information.